Our universe started with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and it has been expanding ever since. We know this because we see other galaxies moving away from us, and they're moving away faster the further away that they are. Space itself is stretching, carrying the galaxies along for a ride. In addition, the wavelengths of light that broke free about 380,000 years after the Big Bang have also stretched and expanded. And we see this light still today. We call this remnant of the Big Bang the cosmic microwave background. First stars appeared about this is a good place to stand, sorry. First stars appeared about 200 million years after the Big Bang, and first galaxies about 1 billion years after the Big Bang. Our own Milky Way galaxy, which is this gorgeous spiral-looking galaxy, is just one of 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And it has been growing and evolving ever since this time, and today contains on the order of 100 billion stars. Our own star, the sun, was born 4.5 billion years ago, or 9.3 billion years after the Big Bang. And along with it, the planets were born too, including our home, the Earth. Our Earth had very violent beginnings. Those violent beginnings included the formation of our moon, which happened through an impact with a Mars-sized object. And also, this impact not just created our companion, but tilted our axis, giving us our seasons. In addition, the moon bears evidence to a period, an extended period from about 4 billion years ago that we call the late heavy bombardment. During this time period, both the Earth and the moon underwent a bombardment by many, many asteroids. Today, the Earth is gorgeous. We have 70% of it of its surface is covered in water. But despite the violent beginnings, the water appeared fairly early on the planet. We think anywhere between 3.8 and 4 billion years ago. And life potentially appeared as early as 3.5 billion years ago through communities called stromatolites, microbial communities called stromatolites. But despite of when life actually appeared on the planet, we know through the beautiful theory of evolution by natural selection that Darwin gave us, and which so beautifully describes the natural world, the diversity of life that we see on the planet. Everything living on the planet today is related to everything else. The only question is when did their last common ancestor live? That everything includes us, our very long line of ancestors, includes our last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos about 7 million years ago. And these are our closest living relatives, and I will be referring to them in tonight's discussion. But this evolution that led to us would likely not have taken place had it not been for a dramatic event that took place about 65 million years ago. An asteroid the size of Manhattan hit Earth near what is Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico today. And following this dramatic effect, all non-bird dinosaurs, because birds are dinosaurs, actually went extinct, and giving the opportunity, allowing small mammals to fill their niches and eventually evolve into us. So who are we? We are Homo sapiens. We belong to the ape superfamily. We belong to the primate order, the mammalian class, and we're in the animal kingdom. We appeared on the planet about 200,000 years ago in Africa. As Francis Collins says, we are all Africans. And I'm hoping, again, to draw on this heritage throughout our discussion tonight. I want to thank the organizers so very much for inviting me to be here with all of you tonight. I'm really, really excited for tonight's discussion. I'm very much a goal-oriented person, so I thought a little bit about what my goals for this evening are. So I'm going to share them with you. I have 4. The first one is kind of shameless. I think when the social media revolution started taking place, I was too busy getting my PhD and raising my young children. So I recently joined Twitter, and I only have 23 followers. I think you would all agree that that's really pretty pitiful. So if you like something I say tonight, you are more than welcome to follow me on Twitter. So that's goal number 1. If I get a few more followers, I'll be really happy. My second goal is one that I really don't want to get embarrassed, and I want to get through the evening without crying. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, she's gonna get upset and start crying because she's not getting her way. No, that's not what I mean. I just don't want to get really emotional about something, talking about something deeply meaningful to me, and start crying. You see, when I watch a Disney movie with my 3 children, they all invariably, periodically look over at me, not because they're trying to figure out whether or not mommy will cry. They know I will. They are just trying to be the first one to catch mommy crying. So I hope I can do better than a Disney movie tonight. That's goal number 2. Goal number 3 is that I really want, when I saw those posters, and I know they're everywhere, and I saw atheist chemist, I thought, oh my goodness, that just sounds so ruthless. So I really, really want to make a dent and make atheist chemist seem just a little kinder, gentler, more generous. I don't know what it is about atheist chemists. Maybe it's a vision of a white lab coat. Maybe it's that in some sense, atheist is perhaps a dirty word in this country. But again, if you walk away tonight just thinking, oh, you know, maybe an atheist chemist can be kind, I'm going to be thrilled. My last goal is that I really hope you will walk away from tonight's discussion and my admittedly very brief description of our cosmic history, marveling at the beauty of the natural world, the picture we have about how the world works, and not just the fact that that's how it works, but the fact that we, humans, have been able to figure this out. Members of your species have been able to figure this out, in some cases by incredible individual achievements, in some cases with a lot of collaboration and work done in large groups. It's sort of amazing, and moreover, you guys are incredibly lucky and fortunate because you live at a time when so many answers are not just there, they don't just exist, you are able to get them so easily. And if you think about it, most of your human ancestors may have wondered why the sky is blue, why we have seasons, why lightning arrives before thunder, but they had no way of knowing, no way of figuring out answers to those questions. You likely know answers to those questions, but even if you don't, you can go to your room and look up on Google and figure out, why the sky is blue. So I hope that you will walk away really marveling at this unique human ability and effort we call science to figure out how the world around us works. I want to finish my opening remarks by telling you a story. And this story goes back to my childhood. I grew up in former Yugoslavia, which at the time was largely a secular society. And so we did not celebrate Christmas. We celebrated New Year's Eve. We did not have Santa Claus. We had Grandpa Frost. Anyone who speaks a Slavic language, it's Deda Mraz. We actually even didn't have a Christmas tree. We had a New Year's Eve tree. It looked just the same with the ornaments and everything. But I was 6 years old when my mother and I were out in the city, and we had walked by a storefront, and I saw a beautiful doll in the window. It was a gorgeous doll with blonde, curly hair. And I had said to my mother that I wished Grandpa Frost could bring this doll to me. And so my mother, we lived very modestly, but my mother did buy this doll for me. And then New Year's Eve, when we were having a party at our house, at midnight, she actually left the doll on the doorstep and rang the doorbell and quickly came inside and ran over to me and said, "It's for you, you should go and open the door." And I went and opened the door, and I remember it so vividly. I remember this feeling just throughout my body of complete and utter disbelief. How did this doll get here? And I ran, I picked up the doll, and I should have been so happy, you know, like I got what I wanted. But I ran over to my mother and I said, look, it's the doll, it's the one I wanted. And she said, well, maybe Grandpa Frost heard you say that you wanted this doll. And I said, but how? How did he know? How could he have possibly heard me? And her answer, I think, only made my disbelief grow even further. And I think I still, in so many things, feel like my 6-year-old self when confronted with the claim of supernatural. And we'll talk a little bit about how we define supernatural. But to me, events that would defy the way that we understand nature works, I again feel like my 6-year-old self going, how could that be? I'm very much looking forward to tonight's discussion. I'm incredibly grateful to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you so much.
I would like to thank Veritas for inviting me to participate in this event, for Columbia University for hosting, and really for each of you. It's really great to see each and every one of you out here, and I hope that you get a lot out of what we share and the discussion that we have. Even though, my alma mater is Cornell, Columbia holds a special place in my heart, so maybe you'll forgive me, because 2 of my siblings got their graduate degrees here, and I know that we are speaking to some of the best and the brightest students in the country. So I'm really excited, in particular for your questions and for an honest discussion. So in this opening segment, as I think Seth may have alluded to, Veritas has asked me to share briefly about my work as a scientist, sort of key lessons that I've learned from science that are germane to today's topic, my commitment to the Christian faith, and how all of these things inform my view about human value and altruism. So that's a tall order for 12 to 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. And you might find that whatever I share elicits more questions than it does answers, but that's great because we're headed straight into some time of Q&A. So for the last 4 years, I've been running a biomedical research laboratory in the Department of Genetics at UNC Chapel Hill. One of the most important discoveries in biomedicine in the 21st century is a class of RNA molecules that we now know is essential for proper human development. And as important as they are for human biology, we didn't even know that they existed 15 years ago. These RNA molecules, they act like cellular switches turning certain genes on and off depending on what the needs of a particular cell are. An increasing number of devastating diseases, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, they can be traced back to these switches not working properly. My lab is interested in these switches. How many different kinds are there? Exactly how do they work? And which ones are relevant in what diseases? As an example, we recently discovered that by controlling one particular switch in the liver, we might be able to help reduce cholesterol levels even more dramatically than statins do, which are the most widely prescribed medication today. Another really remarkable discovery in biology, just in the last decade, is that the human body is home to trillions of microorganisms, mostly bacteria. Trillions. I mean, this is a staggering number. I mean, if you put it in another way, more than 90% or so of the cells in a human body are not human at all. These bacteria live alongside and communicate with other human cells in a variety of our organs, the lung, the skin, the intestine. And it turns out that they're essential for the healthy functioning of these organs. The interesting thing is the environment around us, our exposure to certain chemicals or lifestyle choices, say diet or smoking, these things can help shape and reshape the bacterial composition in our bodies. And these changes in the bacteria can dramatically alter the way that our human cells work. And this is phenomenal because it hasn't touched our DNA at all. So the bacteria in our body, they obliterate this view that humans are defined entirely by their genetic makeup. We're clearly more than human DNA when more than 90% of the cells in our body have bacterial DNA. These examples I'm sharing with you from my own research are constant reminders to me of how we as scientists are just scratching at the surface of knowledge, at the surface of what there is to know and discover about the natural world. It is truly an exciting time, and you can probably hear it in my voice. We're sort of at the edge of a new frontier, I feel like, particularly in very exciting areas like neuroscience, where Ivana has particular areas of expertise. But at the same time, we are at a cultural crossroads in terms of the role of science and scientists in shaping our worldview. Some suggest that science is the sole arbiter of truth, whereas others are increasingly suspicious and wary of science because they believe there's an agenda among many scientists to marginalize anything outside of the natural realm. I've learned a few lessons in my work as a scientist that I think help provide a framework for navigating these difficult waters. And I'll just share, in the interest of time, 2 of them with you today. The first lesson is that science itself reveals to us that it is not the only path to knowledge and truth about human experience. To make this point, I actually want to turn to mathematics. Some of you may know Blaise Pascal. He's a 17th century philosopher and also one of the most notable mathematicians and physicists in history. He noted that his own theorems in geometry, which was his special area of expertise, they rested on certain assumptions that, while intuitively evident, were not provable in the mathematical sense. In one of his famous works in the area of philosophy of mathematics, Pascal states that even in math, there is a bit of a sticky problem when it comes to proving theorems. Theoretically, in a proof, every statement you make must be backed up by another statement. But this other statement itself needs to be backed up. And so you'll be backing up statements ad infinitum. And this is the problem called infinite regress. The way that mathematicians deal with this problem is to say, well, look, we're just going to assume a set of statements to be true because we believe that they're self-evident, and we're just not going to require proof for these. And we're going to call these axioms or postulates. And this led Pascal to make 2 simple but profound conclusions. The first is that the power of logic and reason is bounded by the finiteness of the human mind. The second is that even mathematicians must concede that there are other ways of knowing than just by logic or the scientific method. In other words, these axioms, or these first principles, as he referred to them, that we take to be self-evident, if we're not going to prove them by logic, then by what means do we declare them as true? There must be other ways of knowing than just through reason. I, like Pascal and many before and after him, extol the virtues of human rationalism, but I also accept its finiteness. I'm compelled to concede that science is a useful but not the only road to knowledge and truth, and not the only force that shapes our view of human purpose and value. Notice that I didn't say that it wasn't valuable in helping shape those things, but I think science itself concedes that it doesn't demand that it is the only thing that shapes those things. The second lesson from science is that nothing is quite as random as it seems. So science has increasingly shown that stochasticity or randomness is inherent to many of the most wonderful and remarkable phenomena, including biological evolution. And some have taken this to mean that there could be no larger purpose or meaning in our lives. But one of the most stunning and perhaps paradoxical truths in biology is that apparently random processes lead to ordered, predictable outcomes all the time. A well-known and beautiful example of this is the self-assembly of a viral capsid. The capsid, is the outer protein shell of a virus, and it protects the virus and keeps it alive. The fully formed capsid is actually made of hundreds of smaller parts, so think of it as a massive puzzle with hundreds of puzzle pieces. How do they come together in just the right way for the virus? Science has shown us that the answer is random motion. The puzzle pieces are basically bouncing around in the cell. Bits and pieces come together, they break apart, but eventually, with a specified amount of space and heat and other parameters, the capsid comes together. The puzzle gets fit. There's a video on YouTube, actually, that provides a visual display of capsid self-assembly, and I encourage you to check it out if you're interested. You've got to see it to believe it. An apparently random process yields an entirely predictable and purposeful outcome. This is in part because nothing is quite as random as it seems. Random processes in biology do not occur in a vacuum. They occur within a specific system, for example, a cell. And that defines the boundaries of what can and cannot happen, so that random processes ultimately yield a final product that is more or less reproducible, with minor variations in order to allow for diversity. So these lessons from science, they remind me not to reduce life to merely a series of logical propositions or a set of apparently random processes. Science is an incredibly valuable tool for probing natural phenomena, but I believe it is inherently agnostic with respect to anything that is outside of the natural realm. And if science is not the only path to knowledge, can it be the sole foundation of our ethics or how we assign value? As a Christian, and I know I'm making a big leap here because you may be wondering, how did I become Christian? And unfortunately, I don't have time in this particular segment. But as a Christian, I believe that we do have a value and a purpose that extends beyond the material substance of our lives. And it's the work and the life of Christ that shapes my attitude toward other people. When I was in college studying various religions, including Christianity, one of the most striking things I would learn is that on the cross, Jesus was turning upside down my notions of power. Turns out he wasn't on the cross because he was powerless to stop it. That's how he chose to use his power, solely for the sake of others. The Bible calls this meekness. And meekness in our culture is often misunderstood as weakness or timidity or even fear. But in the original Greek, it actually means something closer to quiet strength, or the expression of power without self-interest and self-promotion. The scriptures say, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. This is the Christian ethic of sacrifice, counting others above yourself. The call to meekness is so important to me as a Christian, not only because it is one of the most salient, defining, distinguishing features of the person of Christ, but also because the scriptures teach that it is vital for experiencing true joy and genuine harmony with fellow man or woman. Whether it be the Syrian refugees fleeing for their lives, or the homeless on the streets outside of our building. The Christian call is not to be safe and sound, bunkered within the confines of our walls. No, it's to be willing to risk ourselves for the life and dignity of others. This is the model of Christ. It is to consider the interests and needs of others, even if it compromises our own safety and our own comforts. I'm compelled to this ethic, not merely out of logic or reason, but my faith in who Christ is, what he's done for me, and the example that he set for me. And justice and service are not optional for whenever it is convenient for me. Instead, they ought to be a way of life, natural outflows of my desire to follow Christ. Many of you will know Dr. Paul Farmer, and I'll end with this. He's the co-founder of the health and social justice organization called Partners in Health. And he's best known for his medical humanitarian work in Haiti. He once said, "The idea that some people matter less than others is the root of all that is wrong in the world." And motivated in large part by Christ, who said, "Whatever you do for the least fortunate, you do for me." Dr. Farmer has spent the better part of his life working for the poor and the disadvantaged. My worldview is aligned with that of Dr. Farmer's, in that altruism is not what we do when we want to feel good about ourselves. It's what we do when we understand what it really means to be human. Thank you.
My first question to you is a look at what we mean when we talk about human beings themselves. What does it mean? What makes a human being a human being? You each articulate very nicely a different worldview. And I'm wondering how you would go about saying, this is what humanity really is at its heart. And I'm going to challenge you to highlight your differences, because I have a feeling you both have a high, loving view of humans. I'd like to know what the difference is between your outlooks.
So let me give it a shot, starting here with some of the biology I alluded to initially, and piggybacking on Professor Sethupathy's last sentence about altruism in humans, and say that altruism is in our genes. We evolved as a social species. There are mechanisms and well understood examples of altruism among many other species beyond humans, starting with eusocial insects, where we see something we refer to as kin altruism, a kind of behavior that leads to the propagation of one's own genes as one helps those related to it. And we also see something in nature commonly we refer to as reciprocal altruism. I do something for you because I expect that sometime in the future you will do the same for me. Vampire bats, for example, vampire bat mothers feed offspring of other vampire bat mothers when they have more blood, and expect other vampire bat mothers to feed their own offspring when they might not have enough. So these examples, I think, go to show that we are not in this alone. The kind of altruistic, the sort of thing we view as pure altruism, the Carnegie Fund heroes, about 100 of them a year, absolutely breathtaking stories of one person or multiple people risking their lives to help another one. I don't view it as misfiring. I don't view it as a purely human feature of humans. I view it as something in our biology. We evolved these behaviors because natural selection has favored organisms who, in fact, exhibited such behavior. And the fact that those behaviors can now be used for perhaps a more pure form of altruism is just not surprising. We see things in the natural world that evolve for one purpose but can be used for many other purposes. And in this sense, we as humans adopt children, right? Why would you invest all that time and energy into an offspring that will not pass on your own genes? We're not the only ones that do it. Chimps do it regularly, as do other primates. And so I think it's the ideal that altruism, which we can define as I do something for you that may even harm me, I think goes very deeply into our biological heritage.
Thank you. Praveen, it's all in the genes?
Yeah, so let me start with a place of agreement. I'm going to try to encapsulate Seth's goals here. Start with a place of respectful agreement, and then maybe highlight some places where I may diverge from Ivana's position. So I do very much agree with the notion that there is some hardwiring in our biology for things like altruism, however we do exactly define that. But it needs to be said that when there's a discussion about the scientific enterprise and what people are discovering with regards to altruism and related concepts, there's this projection that the science is in and that we're done. But I think, just so everybody is aware, this is very much a very active area of work right now. It's exciting. I'm delighted to see it progressing, and I'm very curious to see what experts in that field will find. But I think it's important to understand that it's still sort of in its infancy, this area, and there's a lot more to be learned and uncovered even from a scientific sense. It's also worth noting that one of the leading scientists in this area is Martin Novak at Harvard University, who is actually a devout Christian himself. And while his primary area of work is to develop mathematical models that help us to understand the evolutionary contribution to altruism, he very clearly states that he thinks that the science is quite preliminary, and he has no problem reconciling that even if a lot of altruism can be explained biologically, through biological means, that this is not a nail in the coffin for God or religion, and that religion and our understanding of evolutionary contributions actually go hand in hand in understanding altruistic behavior among humans. So, I think he would be a good resource if you are sort of thinking about someone that is leading in that field, but is not quite at that place to say that it's all hardwired. Okay. The second thing I will say, and this is again a point of agreement here, is that there is at Franz de Waal, Jeff Schloss. These are two names that I'll throw out. One is an atheist, the other is a Christian. Both have written quite eloquently about how, as you look across biological evolution, that you will see an increase in cooperation and in cooperative behavior. So by no means, and I think the science is in on this, by no means is cooperation a uniquely human behavior. In fact, if you try to use biology to find a clear cut between humans and the rest of the species that we know, it's actually quite difficult to do that. That increasingly we find certain parameters that we point to as being uniquely human biologically, and then find that, oh, you know what, that's actually shared by this community of primates or that community of animals. I actually don't believe that there are that many things that separate us biologically from other species. But I think what makes us unique is the spirit that we have been given, the breath of God, as Scripture says. That is not a provable thing. And so as I share that with you, I realize for those in the audience that can feel unnerving, right? And I can talk at length about why I think that it is actually reasonable for a scientist to speak about things like the spirit. But I think where we diverge is the belief that not that we are so different biologically, but we are different in terms of the purpose that we have. We are different in terms of the role that we have been given to care for creation, to care for the rest of the species that we do see. So we are unique and different, in my opinion, in that capacity, and that role, that ontology, I believe, is given by God.
Ivana, what do you think?
So I guess I have a sort of a question back to that and your opening remarks, in which what I'd love to know is, one, how you define God. What is God? And then where in this cosmic history I described very briefly, where do you see God having played a role?
So
are we talking just
Mhm.
2,000 years ago and that's it? Or are we talking, is there a role for God at various points in this incredibly long?
Absolutely. Nothing, in my worldview, nothing happens without God. So and God also exists outside of time, and so constraining him to some portion of human history would not be something that my worldview would be consistent with. I'm going to start with the second question, because what is God? Maybe take the next 100 years for us to discuss. So I'm going to start with the question of where do I see God fitting into this timeline that you have. And I see God fitting into every part of that timeline. So I see God as the author and the originator. And so if we want to use the Big Bang language, I see God as the author of the Big Bang. And I see God also as the sustainer of all of the processes and laws that have been put into place that has brought forth the splendor and the wonder and the majesty of the universe that you alluded to.
Okay, so for example, if I were to, I won't do it because I want my water bottle, but if I were to drop this water bottle, would you say the God is pulling on the water bottle, or would you say that it's falling because of gravity?
I would say that it is falling because of gravity. But then you have to ask the question, who is the author of gravity? Where did this come about? How did this come about?
So my answer is that I think that we ask that why question, having already decided that we're okay with the notion of supernatural, right? So we make a decision, am I going to believe that, for example, a child can be born a virgin, that a person can walk on water, that the Red Sea parted, right? Once I accept those things, then I can begin to say, well, why is there something instead of nothing, right?
So I disagree, because I think it happened very oppositely in my own trajectory. I didn't assume those things before I came to faith. I think a helpful quote here is one from C.S. Lewis, and some in the audience may know him in different capacities. And I hope I don't butcher it, but he said something like, I believe in Christianity in the way that I believe in the sun, not because necessarily I directly look at it, but because by it, I see all things. And so for me, I didn't start from the vantage point of there is a God and supernatural is possible. I think I started from the vantage point of trying to understand who Christ is. And I did that actually with many different faith traditions and trying to piece together and understand what they were trying to communicate. And it was in that process and in really seeing who he was and what he taught that I was able to it was the best explanatory model for me as I observed the world.
I guess I'm still curious about the cosmic history. If you say God played a role in all of it, where, for example, in the evolution of humans, do you think that he came in? I mean, after all,
well, I have no
we've been
idea.
around for a really long time.
Sure. And I fully agree with that. But I don't think that the position of theism demands that we then understand everything about the mind of God and the things that he did. I think saying that I barely understand what my wife does, and that doesn't preclude me from thinking that she is real or that she has that she's done real things. And so, while I think that theism is the best explanatory model, I'm happy to talk about why. It doesn't necessarily demand that I be able to fully comprehend exactly how he did what and how he did it, because that would truly not really be a God that fits in, I think, my worldview. The very notion of God, and I guess this gets to your first question, is that while there may be some things that he wants us to understand about him, we are simply not going to be able to capture, and this refers to the finiteness of the human mind, we're not going to be able to understand everything about who he is and what he did. And so there is a sense in which we will have to speak in the abstract to say, I believe that he is the author of this process, and I believe that he's the sustainer of the process. But I also believe that what this process that we're talking about is governed by natural laws. And I do believe that by and large, he allows those natural laws, right, to run their course and to do their thing. He has put them in place. There is a mystery about what it means to say that he sustains it. And I'm not sure that I fully grasp and understand what that means. But I think the point is that he's the author of it, and that he's also the sustainer of it. And with the caveat that I do believe he allows the things that he put in motion to follow their course. It doesn't mean that he can't interject or that he doesn't interject. But I do think that he knows what he put in motion. He knows that it works, and it does follow its course.
I mean, I guess personally, I'm comfortable with this amazing vision we have for what the universe is, right? And then saying that we can see it go from the very simple to the more complex, resulting in us having this conversation tonight. And then saying that there's something outside of that had played a role in that entire process. To me, the why question comes right back and says, well, how did that something?
So what originated the Big Bang?
Scientists don't know, right? Scientists don't know, and that's okay. They may never know. They may figure it out. There are theories about the multiverse, right? That there are, in fact, more than just our universe. There are other universes, and so, in some sense, I could personally accept even the kind of originator for our Big Bang, who was or were incredibly advanced, living in another universe, and kind of played a game, right? And let's see if we could make the physical laws be like this. Let's watch what happens. But I don't think that that's the same God that is discussed in either the Old or the New Testament. And I sort of, what resonates with me is when Christopher Hitchens used to say that does not sound like a God who would care about what we eat or who is living. Now, the 100 billion galaxies, 10 to the 22, that's 1 to 22 zeros, stars, each one possibly having, at least one, if not more than one planet. It's so incredibly immense and amazing. And to say there's this creator who we don't understand just seems so unsatisfactory.
Okay, I don't think I'm still getting what the unsatisfactory thing is for you, other than the fact that I can't prove it.
Right, so you asked me, where did the Big Bang come from? Then I say, where did your God come from, right? And you can't answer that.
That's what I'm saying. I think we're on the same plane. That's all that I'm trying to establish. I think that oftentimes there's this fallacy that science, because it deals with empiricism, is, on a stronger footing. But I think the reality is that when it comes to a question like this, no one actually knows. And so these are belief systems. Both of us have belief systems here that I think
I would say that your claim is much more extraordinary than my claim, right? And I would say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we see this working really well in science when we say that, if I'm going to show that a drug works better than another drug, I'm going to require 95% confidence level.
Yeah,
but if I'm going to claim, if particle physicists are going to claim that there's a Higgs boson, they had a 1 in 3.5 million chance that their result was wrong, right?
Right.
So in some sense, I feel like the claim of God is so extraordinary. I'd really like to see, I would love it. I think it would be so great, but
I think that's misunderstanding
some sort
what
of evidence.
I think that's misunderstanding what the tools of science can do. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for someone to say, it's not a belief that I find compelling, right? But to say that science refutes the possibility of it because of this notion that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is, I think, applying science to areas that it was never meant to apply. Science is a powerful set of tools for natural phenomena. When it comes to things outside of the natural, it doesn't have anything to say about it. It can't apply probabilities to it. It's neither going to be able to support it, but neither can it refute it. So then we have to talk, again, as I mentioned, more on the level of what Blaise Pascal talked about, where he said the heart knows of things that reason did not. And Blaise Pascal was a reasonably intelligent, intellectual, and logical, rational man.
He didn't know most of what I said, right? I mean,
Well, he wasn't operating off of
idea.
science, he was
Sure,
operating off
sure.
of logic and reason. But the point that he was making is that in our human experience, we don't, as you go about our daily lives, we don't dissect our life into a series of logical propositions or make decisions by the scientific method. There are other ways of knowing and other aspects of our human experience. As the example that I shared when we spoke earlier today, if I had to prove to someone that my wife loved me, I would not be able to prove that, right? But what I would do is relay a series of stories to you that would either be convincing or not, and you could walk away freely being able to say, I don't buy it, or yes, I think the guy's right, his wife does love him. And you would have every right to be able to look at the evidence and decide what is the explanatory model that fits best.
But if I may, I think psychologists would come up with a whole bunch of proxies, right, for how you would measure whether your wife loves you or not. I don't know, they might choose to scan, with NSA having God knows how much information about all of us, right? They may choose to look at her emails to you, or your text messages, or your phone calls, and look for the word love, I could come up with a whole number of experiments to, put some value and say,
I
and 95% confidence. Some studies, where did I read this? Not so long ago, they can predict from how a couple behaves in the first month of the relationship whether or not they're going to be together, at some point. So I feel like that's not a fair example. If your child came to you at age 10 having read Harry Potter books and came to you and said, I talk to Harry, all the time, and he takes me, to Hogwarts, and what would you say to them?
So
Because they say, well, you can't know, right? You can't know.
No, but that's
that.
not actually the same thing, so I can help explain.
Okay, so explain.
So we talked about this earlier. So the idea is that while one may not be able to provide scientific evidence for things that are outside of the natural realm, because that's the very definition of science, it's inherently agnostic with respect to things that are outside of the natural realm. So while scientific evidence in the way that you and I are used to seeing it cannot be provided for God. Other kinds of evidences can be provided. So when we get into historical evidences and literary evidences and things like that, we can actually accumulate lines of evidence and talk about whether we can make inferences from those kinds of things, and we can determine whether certain explanatory models are more plausible than they may have seemed originally when you hadn't investigated those things. And so that's one line of pursuit. And so I may talk with my child about what kinds of historical evidences are there, right? Who said what, right? What was recorded by those who didn't have a skin in the game. Those are the kinds of things that I might say, and very quickly his claim about Harry and Hogwarts would fall apart. Right? But it doesn't. It's debatable, and we could talk about that issue as well, but it doesn't actually fall apart. And this is actually a lot of the work that I did when I sort of put together my own comparative religion course when I was in college. I really, to some extent, went about it as a scientist in terms of saying, here is what I have before me. Let me dig, let me look at what the historical evidences are, and let me try to understand whether the claims made by various faith traditions hold any kind of water when it comes to the traditional tests that are provided for historicity, right, and things like that. These are not things that bring you to faith, because fundamentally, right, there is a leap that one needs to take when they are jumping from the natural to the supernatural. But the point I just want to make is that this notion that it is this blind leap where I've, sort of checked my brain at the door is not actually characteristic of the way in which that leap is made.
Even any follow-up?
So, I mean, I guess I gather you don't read the Bible literally. So my question is, how do you decide what in the Bible you read literally?
Wonderful.
And how do you, in fact, decide that some things are symbolic?
This is a wonderful question.
And so, as a geneticist,
Great
I
question.
am actually fundamentally interested in this child born from an unfertilized egg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, so there are a couple of things you mentioned there. I'll try to hit on all of them. The first thing is, how do you read the Bible? And this is, again, a tremendously big topic, but it's one that turns out that I actually have been going around the country talking about. And so there's actually a whole wealth of knowledge behind how you read the Bible. And to this issue of whether one reads the Bible literally or not, in a side point here, there are a lot of words that we throw around in these kinds of discussions that I think mean different things to different people. And so you should be aware of that, and I don't know that we can really take the time to define all of them in the way that we intend to use them. But be aware that a lot of these words, literal being one of them, is used very differently by lots of different people. To me, reading something literally means reading it with the intent of the author. When an author writes something and I want to understand what it means, in that context, I do read it literally. But I don't read it literally, perhaps, in the sense that when there's observational language, poetic language, the Bible uses lots of literary mechanisms in order to communicate the fundamental points about who God is and how he relates with mankind. And so we can approach the texts much in the same way that we approach all sorts of other historical texts and literary texts. There are all sorts of devices one can use to determine whether something is poetry, or whether something is an eyewitness account, or whether something is observational language. When it says that the sun rises and the sun sets, this is language we use. It's called observational language, and we use it in all sorts of different texts, right? And the church made a grave mistake in pointing out these kinds of things to label Galileo, for example, as a heretic, because an honest introspection of the text actually leads one to realize that it is clearly observational language. There's rhetorical language, there's polemics, and so when you dig into the actual language in which these texts were written, it isn't actually that difficult to tease out what are the literary devices that are being used. And it's rich with literary devices, as is the Quran and many other religious texts. And so we do need to wrestle and do the work instead of doing the easy thing of saying, I take this at face value. That's not being honest with the text. And that's something that I do a lot of speaking on when I talk to various congregations in churches around the country. But I feel like we've veered onto a different, I'm happy to keep talking about this.
No, that's fine. And I want to build on what you're both saying and ask, let's assume that what you're saying is true, each of you, that it is our genetics that basically governs our altruism, that it's something more than that governs our altruism.
I wouldn't say that's the only thing that governs our altruism. I would say it's the beginning of our altruism, and we clearly live as highly social beings. We have, and I do think that religion has played a role in shaping our morality, but we live in societies governed by laws, and I don't think it's all in our biology, but I think the seeds are there. And I don't necessarily think that
I would not want to think that I'm behaving morally because someone is watching me. I would want to think that I'm behaving morally because that's the right thing to do.
Can I quickly address that?
Yeah, I just want to just frame that. Thank you. That's helpful clarification. And the basic question I want to get at is, what does make altruism valuable? And you've started to give me a sense of where you come from. You said, because I think it's right ultimately. And I'm going to be curious to find out on what basis do you assert that something is right. But let me hear what Praveen says first.
Mm-hmm.
No, I just wanted to make a comment to one of the things Ivana said in her statement there, that we wouldn't want to be moral or ethical because someone in the sky is watching us. That isn't the Christian ethic at all, just to be clear. While there may be people who frame it that way, that it's not at all what the text itself says. As I tried to allude to in my opening segment, I'm compelled by who Christ is and the example that he sets for me, and motivated by that to realize that part and parcel of being human and his call to humanity is altruism. So it's not because someone is in the sky and they're going to punish me with a, hit on my hand with a ruler. That's not at all the kind of framework within which I operate. It is actually the demonstration of the fact that a God who made the universe as incredibly large and vast and colorful and beautiful as he did, and as tiny little specks as we are, that he does care about us. That is the theme throughout scriptures, that he is so far bigger than anything we could possibly imagine, and yet he cares. And in fact, it's so confusing to many of the people throughout scriptures that they call out and ask, really? Why? What is man that you are mindful of him? And so the sentiment that you shared is actually a running theme throughout the scriptures of how could it be, what a wonderful, amazing thing that a God that would allow all of this amazing work to transpire would actually care about tiny man, right? And so it is motivated by that love and the example that he sets for us that motivates my altruism, not the notion that otherwise, I'm going to be in trouble.
Does he care about other living beings on the planet, or is it just humans?
No, absolutely, and this is what I was trying to allude to before, is that I think what distinguishes us from the rest of the beings on our planet, and maybe elsewhere too, is that we have a call to actually care for the rest of the species. That is, I think, at the end of the day, what actually separates us from the rest of the species. Less biological and more of a spiritual calling. So I think we do have that role, and it's a scriptural calling that you can see in the text. So absolutely. And
Ivana, I want to make sure I understand the grounding on which your understanding of altruism builds. You mentioned, I don't want to do it because there's somebody watching me, but because it's just right. And I'm curious where that just rightness comes from.
Well, I mean, I'm a mother. I have 3 children, as I alluded to earlier. And I think every parent at some level is amazed at that moment when you see this little nothing, right? The first moment you see this baby and you love them so immensely. Where does that come from? It's not coming from a rational thought. It's not coming from, I'm going to love this thing because if I do, they will grow up to be big and strong and they will pass on my genes. I clearly feel it as love. In fact, I've spoken to many parents who say, when you have your second child or your third child, by that time, you've built this relationship with your first child, and yet this tiny little infant comes along, and you love them just the same. Mm-hmm. And it's really amazing. I don't think that that's something we think about rationally, and I think we can put all sorts of labels on it. We can call it love. We can, but that sort of bond is incredibly important to who we are. And I think it builds from that bond. We build on all sorts of, kind and generous and altruistic behaviors.
Then let's take each of your worldviews out for a test drive, and let's use a specific example, if I may, and let's take the Syrian refugee crisis, which is so much in our hearts and minds right now. I'm strongly guessing that each of you believes it's terrible and that you want to fix it, but I'm curious how your worldview differently informs your response to that crisis.
So I'm really happy to be a scientist and a teacher and not a politician, because I do think that some of these questions are really difficult. Mm-hmm. What is the right thing and how do we do the right thing? I think they're very, very difficult questions. I go back to our shared ancestry in the sense that, 100 years ago, it was, we thought of different races as subspecies, in a sense, of humans. And that was not okay. Not only was it not okay from a moral standpoint of view, it was also absolutely wrong biologically. We now know that any two humans will differ in their DNA, and you will know this better than I do. In 1 in 1,000 base pairs will be different between any two humans. And only 10% from that variation is actually shared within an ethnic group. And 90% of the variation between us or me and anyone in the audience who does not share my geographic or ethnic background will be strictly based on individual to individual, not shared within an ethnic group. So I think that we have this common biology as humans. We have a common biology with the rest of the living world, and I hope we'll get to the discussion of the environment as well, and I'm very happy to hear you make a big stand for that. And I think we just have to, in some sense, I worry about religion being a force in the world that exacerbates some of those divisions. We evolved in small groups of humans. We were hunter-gatherers until about 10,000 years ago when we invented agriculture. We lived in groups of, about 100. And so we evolved this strong sense of in-group versus out-group dynamics, right? Within my in-group, I have people I'm related to. I have people who, if I help them, they will help me. And I worry that in today's globalized world, we need to be thinking much less about the in-group versus out-group, and thinking much more along the lines of what Robert Wright calls non-zero-sumness, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're in a zero-sum relationship, I win, you lose. If we're in a non-zero-sum relationship, we can both win. And I think part of solutions to these difficult global problems would be to look for these non-zero-sum relationships.
And Praveen, I'm going to give you the last word on this segment, which will be just a couple of minutes, and then we want to go to the Q&A.
That's fine. So actually, to underscore quickly, important enough point that I want to take my couple minutes to actually underscore one of the comments that Ivana made. That is, maybe put in another way, that this notion that race is just a social construct and how much genetics has actually taught us in even the last decade or a decade and a half. If you sort of would randomly pick two people from Africa, without regard to location, let's say, you would actually see more genetic differences between them than a randomly selected person from Europe and an arbitrarily selected person from Africa. Right? So I think that underscores the point of how meaningless this notion of race really is, and how much of it has been colored, no pun intended, by what we have just been visualizing by eye and not understanding at the molecular level. So that's a very important point that I thought was worth underscoring. But I think maybe the point that I'll end on is, irrespective of the data and the scientific knowledge that we acquire, science doesn't always give us the tools to know how to use that knowledge, right? So when we got the technology to recombine DNA, or new technology with CRISPR-Cas9 to edit genomes, right? Exciting new technologies and scientific advancements that come into existence, it isn't immediately evident whether we should be using that technology to cure a genetic disease or to create an orange that tastes better, or any number of other things. It's not immediately evident from science itself which of those things we should be doing, right? And so I would question this notion. That doesn't necessarily mean that now I have to turn to God, right? All the point that I'm just trying to make is that I would like to emphasize that there is there's something missing in science itself that doesn't take us all the way in terms of the decisions that we make. And it's worth wrestling about what other factors are coming into play when we make those value decisions in our life.
And if I may,
Briefly,
I absolutely agree. I mean, if I wanted to, decide whether to be friends with someone, right, I would not want to look at their fMRI. That's not how I would want to use science. And in fact, when I want to sort of relate to the human experience, I read books. I don't read scientific articles. So I do think there are other ways of knowing, and there are other things worth knowing. I just look at science as a way to see the natural world.
Okay, and there I see almost an approach toward common ground, which we want to avoid here if at all possible. So I'm now going to take questions from the audience, and through the miracle of modern technology, I can read right off the prompter. So Professor Sethupathy, let me ask you the first question, which you can see. Whereas we have evidence for evolution and Earth's history beyond the supernatural explanation, where do you see evidence for God throughout human history?
Evidence for God and the actions of God cannot be provided in the same way that evidence is provided for natural things, right? So when we talk about scientific evidence for what DNA looks like, or scientific evidence for biological evolution, these are things that we can either see or infer or model through various lines of observable entities or processes, right? Those are not tools that we can use, unfortunately, to provide or evidence for or prove the existence of God. They're simply not compatible. And in some ways, I appreciate that this can be seen as a cop-out. But I think it's only a cop-out if we are already presupposing that the natural world is all there is. If we're willing to presuppose that, right, then I fully appreciate your position that it is a cop-out. But what my position is that the supernatural, okay, while there's an intimate relation with the natural, that the science, which is powerful for probing the natural world, is impotent to probe the supernatural. For there's a different part of our experience that is not quantifiable or describable by human words, but I think many of us experience when it comes to our relationships, right? And when it comes to many other facets and experiences of the human existence, that I would find it hard-pressed to be reductionist and reduce various experiences of my life and my relationships in particular to a set of scientific propositions or a set of logic and reasoned through arguments, right? And so that would essentially be my appeal. Is we don't have time today for me to walk you through all the reasons why I thought that the possibility, how did my explorations break down the barriers to the possibility of a deeper spiritual reality. I would love to talk with you about that. But it's not really, it's when you get to that point that you can really appreciate the conversation about God. But if the starting point is only natural things are plausible and real, then unfortunately I would not be able to provide those kinds of naturalistic evidences for God.
Okay, thank you, Praveen. So now over to you, Professor Hughes, or even if I can. You said that you believe in altruism, that it's not. You said that you believe altruism is not unique to humans. What, if anything, sets us apart from other animals?
So I do think that we share a lot of our basic behaviors with our various relatives, from our obsession with faces. We infants are, drawn to faces as opposed to other pictures. Babies mimic the behavior of an adult interacting with them, and other primates do the same. I think that we clearly go beyond having this discussion. Is not something we're going to find chimpanzees or bonobos doing. I do think that art, visual art and music and performing art and literature and science are all things that make us uniquely human. I do think that science has been sort of born out of this desire to understand the world around us, but that desire predates science, in the attempts of the ancients to understand the world around us. So I think those are some things that make us uniquely human. But I think in terms of what I would label as sort of basic behaviors, we very much share a lot of those basic behaviors with other mammals. The maternal offspring bond, to which I relate very much so. I really identify as a mammal. And social behavior in other primates.
Okay.
That is not to say that that's all, that love and happiness is all that there is in the natural world. There is conflict, the chimps fight, but then they lick each other's wounds. Bonobos are incredibly interesting because the females run over and everybody has sex, and the conflict dissipates. And there is
I don't know what
and
she's
they
suggesting there.
they actually they engage in homosexual sex as well. And so sex evolved for reproduction, but other animals don't say, oh, let's have sex so we can make a baby, right? They can't. They don't understand how reproduction works. We're the only ones who do that.
And I believe, yes, we have a third question, and this is for both of you. This is a toss-up, if you will. What are your views on human rights, whether human rights actually exist or could exist with a Darwinian perspective of the survival of the fittest?
Well, I guess I can, if you don't mind, I'll
Please.
open that one, because I think survival of the fittest is really not the right way to read or think about Darwin's theory of evolution. It implies the best, the strongest. That is not what natural selection does. What natural selection does is it favors the variation that in that environment provides a benefit for survival and reproduction. That doesn't mean that evolution does not strive towards some perfect organism.
Okay, if we accept
Okay.
that definition of
Okay.
Darwinism, where does human rights fit in?
Human rights are incredibly important, and I'm going to refer to my, identification with mammals. I think that one of the very important issues that we have to grapple with in our country is the issue of income inequality and the issue of child poverty. To me, that's a human rights violation. That 22% of children grow up in poverty in this country, I think is simply unacceptable.
Well, with respect, I think the question is getting at why should that matter in a Darwinian understanding of humanity?
Do you want to take that?
I'd like you to stay with that.
I'm still
no
in the
handing
hot
off.
seat. He's not letting me go. Why should it matter? I'm going to let Praveen take a stab, and I'll come back to it.
Okay.
To me, fundamentally, it matters because irrespective of the natural processes that produced human beings and all of the rest of the beings that we see and still are yet to discover, okay, there is, in my worldview, a unique relationship set up between humanity and God. And in that unique relationship, there is, it's not unique as much in the biology as it is in the role and the purpose that we have been given, right? And the role and the purpose that we have been given is actually to rise above some of these very processes. Yes, there is cooperation that is hardwired in our biology to some extent. There's also all sorts of other nasty things hardwired into our biology, and it's complicated. We're still working to understand how all of those things come together. Our models are very, very much in their infancy stage. There's a lot to do. But for me, my answer is irrespective of what we learned there, because what I believe is that there is actually a unique calling placed on humanity toward what I refer to as meekness and toward altruistic behavior, not whenever it suits me, not when it's convenient, but as a way of life, as the very foundation for what my purpose is. And so in that framework, in that context, there's very little that's more important than human rights and how we treat one another. You know, when Dr. Paul Farmer, when he mentioned that, you know, the root of so much evil in the world is the notion that some lives matter less than others, right? That flies in the face of the Christian ethic of sacrifice and the example of Christ and what we were taught in and through him. And so that is, to me, why human rights matters. That's the framework that I would use there.
Thank you. Ivana?
So I do think that we have a social contract that we build with one another. We live in societies in which we need to take care of not just ourselves, but take care of the neediest. And this is one issue that I think is incredibly important, not just in our own country, but throughout the world. I think it's absolutely necessary for us to continue to engage the ways in which we can have laws that are fair, to an economic structure that's fair. Again, I come back to me, the issue of childhood poverty is really critical and very much central.
Well, at the risk of being impertinent, that sounds like a belief.
Oh,
And
absolutely. I'm
I'm
okay with
curious what the
having a
basis of it
belief
is.
about, a belief in our common humanism,
And what is the basis of that belief?
Where does that belief come from? At some level, where did the love for my infant, helpless infant, come from?
Okay. Let's see. I have a final question for each of you, and then I'll wrap us up, if you will. And the question is, first, a request for a one-line reading list and a tip for all of us. And the tip is, well, first, what's one book you would recommend that we read if we wanted to delve deeper into the worldview and the ideas that you began to explore tonight that we couldn't fully embrace? And related to that is there one specific thing that you've done, that you've found has been helpful in developing your worldview, that you'd recommend that we try?
Please.
So I would recommend you actually refer to Frans de Waal. I would recommend his book, The Age of Empathy.
The Age of Empathy.
By Frans de Waal, who studies other primates, and that book has certainly influenced some of my views, and really coming to an understanding of where some of this, kindness and generosity I feel genuinely may have come from. I often say when I talk to friends and they ask me about my own teaching, I say that I treat my students the way I would want someone to treat my children when they are in college. And I've realized that that's really just reciprocal kin altruism, So that's for the recommendation. For the ways in which I have come to my atheist view, which I'm just going to state for the record, is a belief that there's no God. I would say that that's not a belief that's a 100% belief. It's on some continuum. If you asked me to put a number, it would be well over 99%, but it's not 100%. And so, you know, to me, it really does come back to this notion of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And just like my 6-year-old self, I in some sense cannot swallow some of the claims being made. And as we discussed at the coffee earlier today, one of the reasons why one of the things I take issue with religion, I actually do take my kids to church on, you know, major holidays, to the Serbian Orthodox Church. I love going. They and my husband kick and scream on the way there, and then we go in and everyone's really calm, and it's this, I think there are a lot of things about religion that are quite wonderful. For me, lighting a candle in a church is a deeply meaningful experience. But I come back to this belief in the supernatural for which I see no evidence. And I just feel like my 6-year-old self, how could he know? How could he, you know what I'm thinking, right? How could he, and why? And if he created this enormous and beautiful and amazing universe, how could he possibly, you know, care about what we eat or who we sleep with? It really sort of doesn't add up. So that's I think, the line of reasoning by which I, at some level, have come to my worldview.
Okay, thank you. And Praveen, one reading you'd recommend and one suggestion for pursuing your worldview.
Okay, I would, as a starting point, not as a sort of encapsulation of all things germane to this topic, I'd read The Language of God by Francis Collins. I think that it is a good starting point for this kind of topic, to understand a very prominent intellectual in our country who has done a tremendous amount. I'm biased, I trained with him, so maybe I issue that disclaimer, but the kind of contributions that he has made to science and the pursuit of knowledge and truth through science, but is also a committed Christian. And he speaks at length in the book on how those are perfectly harmonious for him. And how they are not in conflict, as they are not for many Christians that are in genetics and in academia in general. Would be a good starting point. If I could just throw in there another one, Deb Harzma, who is the president of an organization called BioLogos. I very much encourage you guys to go and check out, because it's an organization dedicated to the harmony between science and faith. And to
BioLogos?
BioLogos, BIOLOGOS.
Okay.
It's committed to dispelling the sort of false notion that their two are inherently at odds. And there's quite a bit of rigorous intellectual discussion and work that is being done by that organization. And she is the president of it at the moment and has a book with her husband, Lauren Harzma, called Human Origins. She is an astrophysicist, and an incredibly accomplished one at that, and writes very eloquently about, again, the sort of harmony between science and faith, how she sees the wonder and the majesty and the splendor of this world and still is able to come away with feeling perfectly comfortable with the notion of a personal God.